Sometimes the most desperate moments in our lives lead to the most unexpected blessings. When loneliness and necessity collide, even the proudest hearts can find courage to ask for help. Eleanor Whitmore, the wealthiest woman in Cedar Ridge, Montana, approaches mountain man Caleb Stone with an unusual request: marry her for one day to secure her inheritance. What starts as a simple business deal between strangers becomes something deeper. As the town watches and whispers, their temporary union faces unexpected challenges. Eleanor's enemies emerge, and Caleb's protective nature awakens feelings he thought were buried forever. Their one-day marriage tests everything they believe about love and duty. Will Caleb disappear back into the mountains when their agreement ends, or will he make a choice that changes both their lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Cedar Ridge like a soft gray shawl, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of another day in the Montana Territory. In 1885, this frontier town sat nestled in a valley where civilization met the untamed wilderness, where proper ladies in silk dresses shared dusty streets with cowboys, fresh from cattle drives and prospectors. Still chasing dreams of gold, Eleanor Whitmore stood at the tall window of her father's mansion, now her mansion, watching the town come alive below. At 28, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that came from good breeding and careful education. Her auburn hair always perfectly arranged, her posture straight as a church pew. Yet behind her emerald eyes lay a loneliness that all her father's money couldn't cure. The house around her breathed with memories. Heavy oak furniture imported from back east filled rooms that had once echoed with her parents' laughter. Now they stood silent as monuments to a life that felt increasingly hollow. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, had built his fortune in mining and cattle. But he'd also built walls that had protected Eleanor from the rougher elements of frontier life while simultaneously isolating her from any chance of genuine human connection. Miss Eleanor, came the gentle voice of Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who'd cared for the family since Eleanor was a child. The elderly woman entered carrying a silver tea service, her grey hair pinned back in its usual severe bun. "The banker, Mr. Carruthers, is here to see you again," Eleanor sighed, not turning from the window. "I suppose he's brought more papers for me to review. Along with your cousin Marcus, I'm afraid." At that, Eleanor did turn, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Marcus Whitmore, her father's nephew, had appeared like a vulture circling carrion the moment her father's heart had given out 3 months ago. 25 years old and blessed with the kind of easy charm that made people overlook his calculating nature. Marcus had spent his life believing the Whitmore fortune would eventually be his. "Very well," Eleanor said, smoothing the deep blue fabric of her dress. "Show them to the parlor. I'll be down presently." As Mrs. Henderson departed, Eleanor caught her reflection in the window's glass. Her father's will lay in the safe downstairs, its contents known only to her, Mr. Carruthers, and now Marcus, thanks to the lawyer's unfortunate loose tongue during a whiskey-soaked evening at the saloon. The document contained a provision that had seemed merely eccentric when her father was alive, but now loomed like a mountain in her path. She must be married within 6 months of his death to inherit the full estate. Otherwise, everything would pass to the next male heir, Marcus. Her father had believed in his old-fashioned way that a woman needed protection in this harsh world. He'd intended the clause to encourage her to find a husband who could help manage the vast holdings. Instead, it had become a trap that left her vulnerable to fortune hunters and her cousin's machinations. Down in the parlor, 2 men waited with poorly concealed impatience. Harold Carruthers, a thin, nervous man with wire spectacles, clutched his leather satchel as if it contained the crown jewels. Beside him, Marcus lounged in the velvet chair with the casual arrogance of someone who believed himself entitled to everything around him. His blonde hair was perfectly pomaded, his suit expensive, and his smile never quite reached his pale blue eyes. "Eleanor," "Dear cousin." Marcus rose with exaggerated courtesy as she entered. "You're looking well, considering the circumstances, Mr. Carruthers, Marcus." Eleanor took her seat with the practiced grace her finishing school had drilled into her. "I assume this concerns my father's estate?" Carruthers cleared his throat nervously. "Indeed, Miss Whitmore. The 6-month deadline approaches rapidly. In exactly 2 weeks, on October 15th, if you haven't secured a marriage, the terms of the will dictate that everything passes to me," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "Not that I wish for such an outcome, naturally. Family should stay together, after all." Eleanor's fingers tightened on her teacup, but her voice remained steady. "I'm well aware of the timeline, gentlemen." "Of course," Marcus continued, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Which is why I've been thinking, perhaps there's a solution that would benefit us both. I could provide protection for your interests while you search for a more suitable arrangement. A business partnership of sorts." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Eleanor understood perfectly what Marcus was offering: marriage to him, securing the fortune under his control while giving her the illusion of maintaining her position. It was precisely the kind of arrangement that made her stomach turn. "I appreciate your concern," Eleanor replied coolly, "but I believe I can manage my own affairs." "Can you?" Marcus's mask slipped slightly, revealing the predator beneath. "Because from where I sit, you're running out of options. The eligible men in this territory aren't exactly lining up to court the Ice Queen of Cedar Ridge." The words stung because they held truth. Eleanor's wealth had attracted plenty of attention over the years, but her reserved nature and her father's protective influence had kept most suitors at arm's length. Those who'd persisted had been fortune hunters whose intentions were as transparent as window glass. After the men left, Eleanor found herself walking through her father's study, running her fingers along the leather-bound books that had been his pride. Among his papers, she'd found letters he'd written but never sent, letters expressing his worry that his daughter would spend her life alone, that his protection had become a prison. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to secure her future, he'd created a situation that might destroy it. That evening, as was her custom, Eleanor took her horse, Lady, for a ride into the foothills. The mare was a wedding gift from her father on her 18th birthday, a celebration of a marriage that never came. Now Lady served as her escape from the suffocating confines of proper society. It was during one of these rides that she first encountered Caleb Stone, high in the mountains, where the air thinned and the silence stretched like a living thing. Caleb made his home in a cabin he'd built with his own hands. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to rely on no one but himself. His dark hair had grown long in his years of solitude, and his beard framed a face weathered by sun and wind. But it was his eyes, deep brown and holding shadows of old pain, that marked him as a man who'd seen too much of the world's harsh realities. The cabin itself was sparse but well-maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold now in the early autumn air. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the main room, though Caleb rarely had occasion to use the second chair. His bed was a sturdy frame he'd crafted himself, covered with wool blankets and furs from animals he'd trapped. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat the only decoration in the cabin, a small wooden cross, carved with careful precision from mountain oak. It was a remnant from another life, another Caleb Stone who'd believed in providence and purpose. That man had died in a railroad accident 5 years ago, along with his wife Sarah and their unborn child. Caleb had come to these mountains to disappear, to let the man he'd been fade into memory like smoke from a dying fire. He hunted for meat, trapped for furs to trade in town twice a year, and spent his days in the kind of solitude that could either heal a man or drive him mad. For Caleb, it had done a little of both. He'd been a sergeant in the army before his marriage, had served with distinction in campaigns against hostile tribes, Military discipline still showed in the precise way he maintained his equipment and the methodical approach he took to daily tasks. But warfare and loss had taught him that life could change in an instant, that everything you loved could vanish between one heartbeat and the next. The wooden cross on his mantle was carved from a tree that had grown near the small church where he'd married Sarah. He'd cut it down himself to build their marriage bed, keeping one small piece for this memento. Now it served as both reminder and reproach, a symbol of faith he could no longer feel and love he could never reclaim. It was October 1st when their paths first crossed, though neither could have predicted the chain of events that would follow. Eleanor had ridden farther into the mountains than usual, following a deer trail that wound through aspens already turning gold with autumn's touch. Lady picked her way carefully along the rocky path, her hooves finding purchase on stone worn smooth by countless seasons of rain and snow. Caleb had been tracking an elk, moving silently through the trees with the patience his military training had ingrained in him. He heard the horse before he saw it, the careful clip of shod hooves on stone that spoke of a rider used to mountain trails. When Eleanor came into view, he froze behind a stand of pine, studying this unexpected intrusion into his solitary domain. She rode like someone born to the saddle, her body moving in natural rhythm with her mount. Her riding habit was practical but well-made, designed for actual use rather than show. Most striking, though, was the expression on her face, a look of someone seeking something they couldn't name. Someone running from confines they couldn't escape. Caleb watched her pause at her overlook, where the trail opened onto a vista of the entire valley. Cedar Ridge looked like a child's toy town from this height, its buildings and streets laid out in neat patterns that spoke of civilization's attempt to impose order on the wilderness. Eleanor sat her horse for long minutes, gazing down at the world she'd left behind. And Caleb found himself wondering what sorrows had driven her to seek solitude in his mountains. When she finally turned her horse and headed back down the trail, Caleb remained hidden among the trees. But something about the encounter stayed with him through the rest of that day and into the evening. It had been so long since he'd seen another human being that he'd almost forgotten how it felt to be curious about someone else's story. Neither of them knew that in exactly 2 weeks, desperation would drive Eleanor to seek him out with a proposal that would change both their lives forever. Neither could have imagined that a woman accustomed to silk and crystal would find herself standing before a mountain hermit, asking him to solve a problem that proper society had no answer for. But fate has its own timeline, and sometimes the most unlikely solutions present themselves when conventional wisdom fails. In 2 weeks, Eleanor Whitmore would climb this same mountain trail, her father's will clutched in her hand and her heart full of a desperate kind of courage, and Caleb Stone, who'd spent 5 years running from human connection, would find himself faced with a choice that would force him to decide whether he was ready to rejoin the world of the living. Eleanor's decision came to her in the grey hour before dawn, when the house creaked with settling timber and her own restless thoughts. She'd spent the night pacing her father's study, reading and rereading the will that had become both her inheritance and her curse. The marriage contract clause seemed to mock her from the expensive parchment, written in her father's careful hand, as if he'd never considered that his protective instincts might one day trap his daughter. 2 weeks. 14 days to find a husband or lose everything her family had built over 3 generations. The idea that had been circling her mind like a persistent fly finally landed with startling clarity. If she needed a marriage, it didn't have to be a real one. It simply had to satisfy the legal requirements long enough to secure her inheritance. After that, an annulment could restore her freedom while preserving her father's legacy, but who could she trust with such an arrangement? Any man from town would expect compensation far beyond her willingness to pay, or worse, might decide to make the marriage permanent against her wishes. She needed someone with no ties to Cedar Ridge society, someone who wouldn't be tempted by her fortune, because he had no interest in civilization itself, someone like the mountain man she'd glimpsed in the high country. By the time Mrs. Henderson arrived to start breakfast, Eleanor had made her choice. She dressed in her most practical riding habit, secured her father's will in her saddlebag along with her jewelry box, and prepared for what might be the most important and most foolish conversation of her life. The ride into the mountains took 3 hours, following game trails and memory until she reached the area where she'd seen fresh chimney smoke on her previous rides. Lady's breathing came harder in the thin air, but the mare pressed on with the determination that had made her Eleanor's favorite mount. When she finally spotted the cabin tucked into a grove of aspens, Eleanor's courage nearly failed her. The structure looked like it had grown from the mountain itself, built from local stone and timber with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of military precision. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line, and she could see a small garden plot beside the cabin where someone had coaxed vegetables from the rocky soil. She dismounted and tied Lady to a nearby tree, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her skirts. The walk to the cabin's front door felt like the longest journey of her life. Caleb had heard her approach long before she knocked. 5 years of solitary living had sharpened his senses until he could distinguish between the footfalls of deer, elk, bear, and the distinctly different rhythm of a person trying to move quietly. He'd watched through his window as the woman from the overlook, he'd recognized her immediately, tied her horse and walked toward his door. Now she stood on his small porch, her hand raised to knock, and Caleb found himself frozen with uncertainty. No one had visited his cabin in the 5 years since he'd built it. The few times he'd needed supplies or services, he'd ridden down to Cedar Ridge, conducted his business with minimal conversation, and returned to his mountain sanctuary. Her knock came soft but steady, 3 measured raps that spoke of someone accustomed to having doors opened for her. Caleb hesitated another moment, then moved to answer before she could knock again. When the door opened, Eleanor found herself face to face with a man who seemed carved from the mountains themselves. Caleb Stone stood well over 6 feet, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. His hair was longer than fashion dictated, tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his isolation. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Deep brown and wary, holding the kind of careful distance that spoke of old wounds. "Ma'am," he said simply, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone unaccustomed to conversation. "Mr. Stone," Eleanor replied, surprised by her own steadiness. "I wonder if I might speak with you." "About a business proposition." Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly. In all his imaginings of why someone might seek him out, business had never entered his mind. "I'm not much for business," he said carefully. "This is different," Eleanor said. "Unusual, you might say, and quite urgent." Something in her tone, perhaps the barely controlled desperation she was trying so hard to hide, made Caleb step back and gesture her inside. The cabin's interior was spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean. Eleanor noticed the wooden cross on the mantelpiece immediately, its careful craftsmanship speaking of someone who'd once cared deeply about beauty for its own sake. "Coffee?" Caleb offered, moving toward the fireplace where a pot hung over low flames. "Please," Eleanor said, settling herself in one of the 2 chairs at his table. She watched him pour the dark liquid into 2 tin cups, his movements economical and precise. Everything about the cabin spoke of a man who'd stripped his life down to essentials, who'd found a kind of peace in simplicity. When he set the coffee before her and took his own seat, Eleanor found herself studying his hands. They were workman's hands, scarred and calloused, but they moved with surprising gentleness. Whatever gentility he'd once possessed hadn't been entirely buried by his years of isolation. "This proposition," Caleb said. Breaking the silence that had stretched between them, Eleanor took a breath that seemed to come from her very soul. "I need to get married." The words hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Caleb's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or concern That's not usually something that requires a business meeting, he said carefully. It does when the marriage only needs to last one day. Now Caleb's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. He set it down slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. I think you'd better explain. Eleanor reached into her saddlebag and withdrew her father's will, unfolding it on the table between them. My father died 3 months ago. According to his will, I must be married within 6 months of his death or forfeit my inheritance to my cousin. Caleb glanced at the document, but didn't touch it. And you have 2 weeks left. Exactly. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she outlined her plan. I need a marriage that satisfies the legal requirements, but can be easily annulled afterward. Someone with no connections to Cedar Ridge society, no interest in my fortune, and no reason to complicate the arrangement with personal feelings. Someone like me, Caleb said quietly. Someone exactly like you. The silence that followed stretched until Eleanor began to fear she'd offended him beyond redemption. Caleb rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the mountains that had sheltered him for so long. What makes you think I'd agree to such a thing? He asked without turning around. Eleanor had prepared for this question. Because you're a man of honor, she said simply. I can see it in the way you maintain this place, in the courtesy you've shown me despite my intrusion, and because you understand what it means to want to escape from something. Caleb turned back to face her, and she saw that her words had found their mark. You don't know anything about me. I know enough, Eleanor replied. I know you've been hurt badly enough to choose solitude over society. I know you value your independence above all else. And I know you're the only person I've met who might understand that sometimes the most desperate situations require the most unconventional solutions. From her saddlebag, she withdrew a sheet of paper she'd prepared during her sleepless night. I've drafted a marriage contract outlining the terms. 1 day only, with the ceremony performed in Cedar Ridge to satisfy the legal requirements. Afterward, we return here. You sign papers for an annulment and we part ways. In exchange, I'll pay you enough to live comfortably for years, if that's what you choose. Caleb read the contract slowly, his expression unreadable. The terms were exactly as she'd described. A business arrangement with no emotional complications, no ongoing obligations, no interference with his chosen way of life. Why me? He asked again. Because, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, you're the only person I've met in years who didn't look at me and see dollar signs. When our paths crossed on the trail, you didn't even show yourself. Most men would have seized the opportunity to make my acquaintance, hoping to benefit somehow from the connection. You simply let me pass. The observation surprised Caleb with its accuracy. He had indeed watched her that day, but his reasons had nothing to do with fortune or social climbing. He'd simply been struck by her air of searching, the way she'd sat her horse at the overlook, as if looking for something she'd lost. This cousin of yours, Caleb said. He won't simply accept the situation. Marcus is calculating, not stupid, Eleanor replied. Once the inheritance is legally secured, there's nothing he can do. The will doesn't specify that the marriage must be permanent, only that it must exist by the deadline. Caleb moved back to his chair, his decision already half made, though he hadn't yet admitted it to himself. There was something about Eleanor Whitmore that called to the man he'd once been, the soldier who'd protected others, the husband who'd cherished what was precious. She was asking for protection of a different sort, but the instinct was the same. 1 day, he said finally. 1 day, Eleanor confirmed, and then I come back here, and we never see each other again. Never, she agreed, though something in her chest tightened at the words. Caleb looked once more at the contract, then at the woman who'd ridden into his mountains with a proposal that belonged in a dime novel. When? The ceremony needs to take place by October 15th. That's 11 days from now, and you trust me to honor this agreement. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Mr. Stone, I'm trusting you with my entire future. If I can't read character well enough for that, then I deserve whatever consequences follow. The weight of her trust settled on Caleb's shoulders like a familiar pack. It had been so long since anyone had relied on him for anything more significant than trading furs that he'd almost forgotten what responsibility felt like. "I'll need to come to town early," he said. "Get cleaned up, find appropriate clothing for a wedding." "Of course. I'll arrange accommodations at the hotel and have suitable clothes waiting." They spent the next hour working out the practical details, their conversation gradually becoming more natural as the strangeness of the situation settled into simple logistics. Eleanor found herself studying Caleb's face as he spoke, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the careful consideration he gave to each aspect of their arrangement. When she finally rose to leave, Caleb walked her to her horse. Lady whinnied softly as Eleanor gathered the reins, and Caleb instinctively reached out to stroke the mare's neck. "She's beautiful," he said, and Eleanor heard genuine appreciation in his voice. "Her name is Lady. She was my 18th birthday gift from my father." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement that they were both people who'd lost things they'd treasured, who understood the weight of memory and the burden of moving forward alone. "October 10th, Eleanor said as she mounted. "Come to the Grand Hotel. Ask for the Whitmore Suite." "October 10th, Caleb confirmed. Eleanor rode away without looking back, but she carried with her the image of Caleb Stone, standing in front of his mountain cabin, watching her go with an expression she couldn't quite read. She'd set events in motion that would change both their lives, though neither of them could yet imagine how profound those changes would be. Behind her, Caleb remained in his doorway long after the sound of Lady's hooves had faded into the mountain silence. The contract Eleanor had left behind sat on his table like evidence of a vivid dream, proof that his solitary existence had just taken a turn toward complications he'd spent 5 years avoiding. Yet as he returned to his evening routine of banking the fire and securing his cabin for the night, Caleb found himself thinking not about the strangeness of Eleanor's proposal, but about the loneliness he'd glimpsed in her eyes, a loneliness that matched his own in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable. In 5 days, he would leave his mountain sanctuary for the first time in months. In 11 days, he would stand before a preacher and speak vows that were meant to be temporary, but would feel disturbingly real. And somewhere beyond that, in a future he couldn't yet see clearly, the careful walls he'd built around his heart would begin to crumble in ways that would terrify and transform him. But for now, there was only the mountain silence and the weight of a promise made to a woman who'd had the courage to ask for exactly what she needed. Consequences be damned. October 10th arrived with the crisp clarity that only mountain autumn could provide. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose, and wondered if she was making the greatest mistake of her life. In her jewelry box on the dressing table lay her mother's wedding ring, a simple band of white gold, set with a modest diamond that had been worn with love for 23 years. Catherine Whitmore had died when Eleanor was 16, but her final words to her daughter had been about love. "Don't settle for anything less than a heart that beats in rhythm with yours," she'd whispered, her hand weak but warm as she pressed the ring into Eleanor's palm. "Promise me you'll wait for real love, even if it takes a lifetime to find." Now Eleanor held that same ring, knowing she was about to break her mother's dying wish by entering a marriage based on necessity rather than affection. Yet what choice did she have? Marcus had made it clear that he considered the inheritance already his, and the steady stream of visitors to his temporary residence in town suggested he was already making plans that didn't include her welfare. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her weathered face creased with worry. "Miss Eleanor, are you certain about this arrangement? It's not too late to reconsider. What would you have me do?" Eleanor asked, slipping her mother's ring onto her finger, where it felt both familiar and foreign. "Marry Marcus and spend the rest of my life as his prisoner? Or perhaps one of the other eager suitors who've suddenly appeared now that my deadline approaches?" Indeed, news of Eleanor's predicament had somehow leaked beyond the lawyer's office, and the past week had brought a parade of fortune hunters to her door. Men who'd never given her a second glance were suddenly declaring their devotion, each proposal more transparently mercenary than the last. This mountain man could be dangerous, Mrs. Henderson persisted. You know nothing about him. Eleanor turned from the window, her decision crystallizing with the movement. I know he could have taken advantage of me when I was alone in his cabin, and he didn't. I know he listened to my proposition without trying to change the terms to benefit himself. And I know he's the only man who's looked at me in years without calculating my net worth. The housekeeper's expression softened. She'd watched Eleanor grow from a spirited child into a guarded young woman, had seen how wealth and her father's protection had gradually isolated her from genuine human connection. Your mother would want you to be happy, she said gently. My mother would want me to be free to choose my own path, Eleanor replied. And that's exactly what this arrangement will give me. At the Grand Hotel, Caleb Stone stood before a mirror in the finest room he'd ever occupied, struggling with a starched collar that felt like a noose around his neck. The suit Eleanor had provided fit perfectly. She'd estimated his measurements with surprising accuracy, but wearing it felt like donning a costume for a play he'd never rehearsed. The transformation was remarkable. The mountain hermit had disappeared, replaced by a man who looked like he belonged in polite society. His hair had been professionally cut and styled, his beard trimmed to fashionable proportions. The suit was well-tailored dark wool, conservative but expensive, with a vest and watch chain that spoke of respectability. Yet Caleb felt like an imposter. The man in the mirror might fool casual observers, but he knew the truth. Beneath the civilized veneer, he remained someone who'd chosen solitude over society, silence over conversation. What right did he have to stand beside Eleanor Whitmore and speak vows in front of the entire town? A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, expecting the hotel porter. Instead, Eleanor herself entered, and Caleb's breath caught in his throat. She wore a traveling dress of deep burgundy silk, elegant but practical, with her hair styled in a way that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. But it was her expression that stopped him, a mixture of determination and vulnerability that made her seem younger and more human than the composed heiress he'd met in his cabin. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed," she said, her gaze taking in his transformation. "You look very handsome." The compliment caught Caleb off guard. "I feel like a fraud." "You look like a gentleman," Eleanor corrected, "which is what we need for this to work." She moved to the window, gazing down at the street where townspeople were already beginning to gather. Word of Eleanor Whitmore's sudden wedding had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, and curiosity had drawn half the population to witness the event. "Are you having second thoughts?" Caleb asked, studying her profile. "Constantly," Eleanor admitted. "But not about the necessity of what we're doing, only about whether I have the right to ask it of you." "You're not asking," Caleb reminded her. "You're paying." "There's a difference." Eleanor turned to face him, and he saw something flicker in her eyes, hurt, perhaps, or disappointment. "Is that how you see this? Simply a business transaction?" Caleb considered the question more seriously than she might have expected. "I'm trying to," he said finally. "It seems safer that way." Safer for whom? Before Caleb could answer, another knock interrupted them. This time it was Mrs. Henderson, come to escort Eleanor to the church. "The carriage is waiting, miss," she said, then paused as she took in Caleb's appearance. "My word," she murmured. "You clean up quite well, Mr. Stone." Eleanor gathered her small bouquet, white roses from her mother's garden, and moved toward the door. "The ceremony begins in 30 minutes, she told Caleb. "The minister is expecting us, and the witnesses are arranged. All you need to do is say 'I do' when prompted." "And after?" Caleb asked. "After we attend a brief reception for appearance's sake, then return to your mountains. By tomorrow morning, you'll be free to resume your life as if none of this ever happened." The words should have been reassuring, but instead they left Caleb with an odd sense of loss. As Eleanor departed with her housekeeper, he found himself wondering why the prospect of returning to his solitary existence suddenly felt less appealing than it had a week ago. At the small church that served Cedar Ridge's spiritual needs, Reverend Samuel Morrison waited, with the mixture of excitement and apprehension that marked all small-town ministers facing unusual circumstances. Eleanor had approached him privately to arrange the ceremony, and while the request had been unorthodox, he could find no religious objection to performing a legally binding marriage between two consenting adults. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were undercurrents to this union that he didn't fully understand. Eleanor Whitmore was known throughout the territory as a woman of unimpeachable character, but her sudden decision to marry a virtual stranger raised questions that polite society wouldn't voice, but everyone would wonder about. The church filled quickly with curious townspeople, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of anticipation that felt more like a social event than a religious ceremony. Near the front, Marcus Whitmore sat with barely concealed anger, his pale eyes fixed on the altar where his cousin would soon surrender his inheritance dreams forever. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, walking down the aisle alone as she'd insisted. She'd rejected tradition in favor of independence, just as she'd rejected Marcus's increasingly desperate attempts to change her mind. Her chin was raised, her step steady, and she looked every inch the confident woman taking control of her own destiny. When she reached the altar, Eleanor turned to face the church doors, waiting for her groom to appear. The assembled crowd grew quiet, and in the silence she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then Caleb appeared in the doorway, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. The mountain man had been replaced by a gentleman who moved with quiet confidence down the aisle, his gaze fixed on her face rather than the curious stares of the congregation. When he reached her side and offered his arm, Eleanor felt a jolt of unexpected warmth at the contact. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Morrison began, his voice carrying easily through the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Eleanor Catherine Whitmore and Caleb James Stone in holy matrimony." As the familiar words washed over them, Eleanor found herself studying Caleb's profile. In the church's soft light, she could see the care he'd taken with his appearance, the way he held himself with military bearing despite his obvious discomfort with the situation. This was a man accustomed to keeping his word, she realized. Someone who would honor their agreement even if it cost him personally. "Do you, Caleb James Stone, take Eleanor Catherine Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Caleb's voice was steady when he answered, "I do. Do you, Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, take Caleb James Stone to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Eleanor looked into Caleb's brown eyes and felt an unexpected pang of regret that these vows were merely temporary. "I do. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The moment stretched between them, fraught with complications neither had anticipated. Then Caleb leaned down and pressed his lips to Eleanor's in a kiss that was meant to be ceremonial, but felt disturbingly real. When they parted, Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her question everything she thought she knew about their arrangement. As the congregation erupted in polite applause and the newlyweds turned to face their audience, neither of them noticed Marcus Whitmore slip quietly from his pew and disappear through the church's side door. His face was set in lines of fury, and his hands were clenched into fists that spoke of a man whose carefully laid plans had just crumbled into dust. The die was cast, the vows spoken, the marriage legally binding. Eleanor Whitmore was now Eleanor Stone, and her inheritance was secure. But as she walked back down the aisle, with Caleb's arm supporting hers, she began to realize that some arrangements are more complicated than they appear on paper, and some business transactions have a way of becoming deeply personal whether you plan for it or not. The reception Eleanor had arranged was deliberately modest, a simple gathering in the hotel's dining room with cake, coffee, and enough social pleasantries to satisfy appearances. She'd invited only the essential witnesses and a few family friends, wanting to minimize the spectacle while ensuring the marriage's legitimacy couldn't be questioned. Caleb stood beside his new wife, accepting congratulations from strangers with the same stoic patience he'd once shown during military inspections. The starched collar still felt like a trap, but he'd discovered an unexpected protectiveness toward Eleanor that made the discomfort bearable. When well-meaning townspeople asked about their courtship, he deferred to her with a gallantry that felt both foreign and strangely natural. "Such a romantic story," gushed Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, clutching Eleanor's hand with enthusiasm. "A mountain romance, just like something from those novels they print back east. However did you two meet?" Eleanor had prepared for this question. "Mr. Stone helped me when my horse went lame during a mountain ride," she said smoothly. "We discovered we had much in common despite our different backgrounds. It wasn't entirely a lie. They had discovered unexpected common ground during their negotiation. Both were people who valued their independence, who'd been shaped by loss, who understood the difference between solitude and loneliness. And how long have you been courting?" Mrs. Patterson persisted. "Long enough to know we suited each other," Caleb interjected, his deep voice carrying a note of finality that discouraged further questions. Across the room, Marcus Whitmore nursed a whiskey and watched the proceedings with barely concealed fury. He'd spent months positioning himself as Eleanor's natural protector, had even gone so far as to court several potential business partners based on his expected inheritance. Now those plans lay in ruins, destroyed by a mountain hermit who'd appeared from nowhere to claim what Marcus considered rightfully his. Quite a surprise. "This wedding," said Henry Carruthers, the banker, approaching Marcus with the nervous manner of a man bearing unwelcome news. "I suppose this settles the inheritance question definitively, does it?" Marcus asked, his voice deceptively mild. "I wonder how thoroughly you investigated this Mr. Stone's background. A man could claim to be anyone, especially if there's enough money involved." Carruthers shifted uncomfortably. "The marriage license is properly filed, and Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony. Everything is legally binding." "Of course it is," Marcus replied. But his tone suggested the conversation was far from over. Meanwhile, Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of her new husband's presence beside her. During the ceremony, she'd been focused on the legal necessity of their union. Now, in the more intimate setting of the reception, she began to notice details that surprised her. The way Caleb instinctively moved to shield her from the crowd's more persistent attention. The careful courtesy he showed to Mrs. Henderson, treating the elderly housekeeper with the same respect he'd give a duchess. The way his hand briefly touched the small of her back when guiding her through the reception line, a gesture so natural she wondered if he was even aware of it. Most unsettling was his military medal, which she glimpsed when his jacket shifted as he reached for a coffee cup. It was partially hidden beneath his vest, but she caught sight of polished bronze and a ribbon that spoke of service and sacrifice. Here was another piece of Caleb Stone's carefully guarded history. Another indication that her mountain hermit was more complex than he appeared. "You served in the army," Eleanor observed quietly during a lull in the conversation around them. Caleb's hand moved instinctively to his chest, then stopped. "A long time ago." "What regiment?" "7th Infantry. Before I came to Montana." Eleanor wanted to ask more, but something in his expression warned her away from the subject. Instead, she filed the information away with the growing collection of details about the man she'd married for convenience, but was beginning to see as genuinely mysterious. As the afternoon wore on, the reception gradually wound down. Well-wishers departed with promises to call soon, and Eleanor found herself standing in the hotel lobby with Caleb, both of them suddenly uncertain about the next step in their arrangement. "I should change out of this dress," Eleanor said, gesturing toward her wedding attire. "Something more practical for the ride to your cabin." "About that," Caleb said, his brow furrowing. "Are you certain you want to make that journey today? It's a hard ride, and you're not dressed for mountain trails." Eleanor had insisted on accompanying him back to his cabin immediately after the ceremony, partly to maintain the fiction that they were a normal married couple, but mostly because she needed to see this strange adventure through to its conclusion. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Stone. Caleb," he corrected automatically. "If we're married, even temporarily, you should use my given name." The reminder of their new relationship sent an odd flutter through Eleanor's chest. "Caleb, then, and you should call me Eleanor." They stood looking at each other in the hotel lobby, husband and wife by law, but strangers by choice, each wondering what the evening would bring. The practical aspects of their arrangement suddenly seemed fraught with complications neither had fully considered. "I'll get my things," Eleanor said finally. "Give me 15 minutes." Caleb watched her ascend the hotel stairs, noting the grace with which she moved, despite the day's emotional strain. When she disappeared from view, he became aware of hostile eyes upon him and turned to find Marcus Whitmore approaching with the predatory smile of a man who believed he held winning cards. "Congratulations on your marriage," Marcus said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "Quite a fortunate turn of events for a simple mountain man." "Mr. Whitmore," Caleb acknowledged with a nod. "I find myself curious about your background," Marcus continued. "It's not often a hermit emerges from the wilderness to marry the wealthiest woman in the territory. One might wonder what motivated such a remarkable transformation." Caleb studied Eleanor's cousin with the same careful attention he'd once given to potentially hostile terrain. Marcus was the type of man he'd encountered in the army, privileged, entitled, and dangerous when thwarted. "I'd say love motivated it," Caleb replied evenly. "But I don't suppose you'd understand that concept." Marcus's smile faltered slightly. "Love? How romantic. And how convenient that this great love affair bloomed just as Eleanor's inheritance deadline approached." "Convenient timing doesn't invalidate genuine feeling," Caleb said. "But again, I don't expect you to understand." The two men faced each other in the hotel lobby, and despite Marcus's advantages of education and social position, it was clear who held the upper hand. Caleb's military bearing and calm confidence made Marcus look like what he was, a spoiled young man playing at being dangerous. "This isn't over," Marcus said quietly. "Marriage certificates can be invalidated. Backgrounds can be investigated. I'll find a way to prove this is fraud." "You're welcome to try," Caleb replied. "But you might want to consider whether it's wise to threaten a man's wife in front of him." The warning was delivered in a conversational tone, but something in Caleb's eyes made Marcus step back involuntarily. The mountain man might prefer solitude, but he'd clearly learned how to handle men like Marcus Whitmore during his years of service. When Eleanor returned, wearing a practical traveling dress and riding boots, she found the two men regarding each other with obvious hostility. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "No problem at all," Marcus said, his pleasant mask sliding back into place. "I was just congratulating your husband on his good fortune." "Not every man is lucky enough to marry into wealth," Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger. "Not every man is honorable enough to marry for love rather than money," she replied coolly. "I consider myself the fortunate one in this arrangement." The words were meant to maintain their fictional romance, but as Eleanor spoke them, she realized they contained more truth than she'd intended. Caleb had agreed to her proposal without attempting to modify the terms in his favor, had treated her with respect and courtesy throughout their brief acquaintance, and was now clearly prepared to defend her against her cousin's hostility. "Of course," Marcus said, his tone suggesting he believed none of it. "Well, I'm sure you're eager to begin your new life together. Don't let me keep you." As Marcus departed, Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "He's going to cause trouble," she said quietly. "Let him try," Caleb replied. "The marriage is legal, and that's all that matters." But as they prepared to leave Cedar Ridge for Caleb's mountain sanctuary, neither of them realized that Marcus had already set investigative wheels in motion. Before the newlyweds reached the cabin, he would have men searching through military records, looking for any irregularity in Caleb Stone's background that might provide grounds for annulment. The game between Marcus and Eleanor was far from over. It had simply changed rules and added a new player whose protective instincts were about to be tested in ways he hadn't experienced. Since the war, as Caleb helped Eleanor mount, ready for the journey to his cabin, their hands touched briefly, and both felt the same unexpected jolt of awareness they'd experienced during their wedding kiss. Their business arrangement was becoming something more complicated with each passing moment, whether they were prepared to acknowledge it or not. The afternoon sun slanted through the mountain passes as they began their ride toward Caleb's sanctuary. Two people bound by law but separated by caution, each wondering if they'd just made the best or worst decision of their lives. Behind them, Cedar Ridge buzzed with speculation about the unlikely marriage, while ahead lay an evening that would test the boundaries they'd so carefully established around their hearts. The ride to Caleb's cabin took 3 hours, along mountain trails that grew increasingly narrow and steep as they climbed toward his sanctuary. Eleanor rode in thoughtful silence, her body moving naturally with Lady's gait, while her mind struggled to process the day's events. Behind her, Caleb followed on his own horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Ranger that he'd trained with the same patient precision he applied to everything in his mountain life. As they climbed higher, the aspens gave way to pine and spruce, their branches heavy with the promise of winter snow. The air grew thinner and cooler, carrying scents of wood smoke and approaching twilight. Eleanor found herself grateful for her practical traveling dress, though she noticed Caleb's concerned glances when the trail became particularly treacherous. "Not much farther," he called when they paused to rest the horses at a small clearing. "Are you holding up all right?" "I'm fine," Eleanor replied, though she was beginning to understand why Caleb had questioned her decision to make this journey immediately after their wedding. The physical demands of the mountain trail were considerable, and she could feel the day's emotional strain settling into her bones like a familiar ache. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that took Eleanor's breath away. She'd been impressed by the structure during her first visit, but seeing it in the evening light revealed details she'd missed before. The logs were carefully fitted without chinking, sealed with what looked like pine pitch mixed with clay. The roof was covered with split shakes that would shed snow efficiently, and the stone chimney rose straight and true, its construction speaking of someone who understood mountain winters. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said as Caleb helped her dismount. "You built this yourself?" "Took me most of a winter," Caleb replied, leading both horses toward a small stable behind the cabin. Had plenty of time to get it right. While he tended to the animals, Eleanor walked slowly around the cabin's exterior, noting the small vegetable garden with its neat rows of winter squash and root vegetables. The carefully stacked woodpile that would see him through the cold months. The rain barrels positioned to catch water from the roof. Everything spoke of a man who'd learned to live entirely by his own efforts, who'd found a kind of peace in self-sufficiency. From her jewelry box tucked safely in her saddlebags, Eleanor retrieved her mother's music box, a delicate thing of rosewood and brass that played a sweet melody when wound. She'd brought it impulsively, perhaps needing something familiar in this strange new world she'd entered. As she stood in the gathering dusk, holding the small treasure that represented her childhood dreams of love and family, Eleanor wondered if she'd just made the greatest mistake of her life. "Cold out here?" Caleb said, appearing at her elbow with their bags. "Let's get inside and get a fire started." The cabin's interior felt different in the evening light, warmer and more welcoming than it had during her businesslike morning visit. Caleb moved efficiently around the space, lighting oil lamps and building up the fire until the main room glowed with golden light. Eleanor stood uncertainly near the door, suddenly aware that she was alone in a remote cabin, with a man she barely knew, married to him by law but strangers in every way that mattered. "Coffee?" Caleb offered, noting her discomfort. "Or I've got some tea, if you prefer." "Tea would be lovely," Eleanor said, settling herself in one of the chairs at his small table. She watched him prepare the simple meal he'd planned: bread, cheese, preserved meat and apples from his own trees. The domesticity of the scene felt surreal after the formal ceremony and reception in town. "Tell me about your time in the army," Eleanor said as they shared the simple supper. "You mentioned the 7th Infantry." Caleb's hand paused halfway to his mouth, then continued the motion with deliberate casualness. "Not much to tell. I served 8 years, got out as a sergeant. Came to Montana afterward. That's quite a long service record." "You must have seen considerable action." "Some," Caleb admitted. "Enough to know I preferred peace to conflict." Eleanor sensed deeper currents in his careful answers, but didn't press. Instead, she found herself studying his hands as he ate. They were steady, efficient, but she noticed a small scar across his knuckles that looked like it might have come from a blade. This was a man who'd faced violence and survived it, who'd chosen isolation not from weakness, but from hard-won wisdom about the world's darker truths. "What about you?" Caleb asked, clearly wanting to shift the conversation away from his military past. "What was your life like before your father died?" Eleanor considered the question, realizing that no one had asked her about her own experiences in months. Everyone wanted to know about her inheritance, her plans, her availability for marriage, but no one seemed curious about her as a person rather than a prize to be won. "Lonely," she said finally. "My father loved me, but he was so protective that I rarely had genuine friends. The young women in town were either intimidated by my family's wealth or determined to use our friendship for social advancement. The men were interested in my fortune rather than my character. I spent most of my time reading, writing, and managing the household accounts." "You manage the accounts yourself?" "My father insisted I learn business principles. He said a woman with property needed to understand how money worked, even if she planned to marry eventually." Eleanor's voice carried a note of irony. "I suppose he never imagined I'd use that knowledge to arrange a marriage of convenience." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly in the background. Eleanor found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. There was something deeply peaceful about the cabin's simplicity, the way it offered refuge from the complications of the outside world. "I should probably sleep in the stable," Caleb said suddenly, as if the thought had just occurred to him. "Give you privacy for the night." Eleanor looked around the one-room cabin, realizing they'd never discussed sleeping arrangements. The oversight seemed glaring now, though she supposed her focus had been so completely on the legal aspects of their arrangement that practical considerations had been pushed aside. "That's ridiculous," she said. "It's your home and it's October in the mountains. You'll freeze to death out there. There's a bed," Caleb pointed out, gesturing toward the simple frame in the cabin's far corner. "Only one bed." The statement hung between them, fraught with implications neither was prepared to discuss. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to address the situation with the same practical approach she'd brought to their entire arrangement. "We're both adults," she said carefully, "and this is a temporary arrangement based on mutual benefit rather than romance. I'm sure we can manage to share space for one night without compromising anyone's virtue." Caleb studied her face in the lamplight, looking for signs of uncertainty or distress. What he saw instead was the same quiet determination that had brought her to his mountain in the first place, the strength that had allowed her to propose marriage to a virtual stranger rather than surrender to her cousin's machinations. "I'll take the floor," he said finally. "I've slept in worse places." "Absolutely not," Eleanor replied firmly. "I won't have you uncomfortable in your own home because of my presence. The bed is large enough for 2 people to sleep without impropriety. We simply need to be sensible about it." As evening deepened into night, they settled into an awkward but workable routine. Eleanor used the small alcove behind a curtain that served as Caleb's washroom to change into the simple nightgown she'd packed, while he banked the fire and made final preparations for sleep. When she emerged, modestly covered by her traveling robe, she found he'd changed into clean woolen pants and a cotton shirt. "I'll turn down the lamps," Caleb said, moving around the room to extinguish all but one small flame near the bed. In the dim light, they approached the sleeping arrangement with the careful formality of diplomats negotiating a treaty. Eleanor settled herself on the far side of the bed, her back to the center, while Caleb lay down on the near side, also facing away. Between them stretched a careful space that neither intended to violate. "Good night, Eleanor," Caleb said quietly. "Good night, Caleb." But sleep proved elusive for both of them. Eleanor lay listening to Caleb's careful breathing, acutely aware of his presence just arm's length away. The day had been full of surprises. The way he'd looked in formal clothing, the protective way he'd positioned himself during the reception, the glimpses of humor and intelligence in their conversation. This was not the simple mountain hermit she'd expected, but a complex man with hidden depths and carefully guarded secrets. For his part, Caleb found himself studying the play of moonlight across the cabin's log walls, hyper-aware of Eleanor's slight movements as she settled into sleep. Her presence had transformed his sanctuary in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The cabin felt different with her in it, warmer, more alive, charged with possibilities he'd thought he'd buried along with his past. Sometime near midnight, a sound outside brought both of them instantly awake. Caleb's military training took over, and he moved silently from the bed to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the moonlit clearing around his cabin. "What is it?" Eleanor whispered. "Probably nothing," Caleb replied, but he remained at the window for several more minutes before returning to bed. "Sometimes elk wander through the yard. They're curious about human scent." Eleanor nodded, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. As she finally drifted toward sleep, she found herself wondering if Marcus's threats had been more serious than she'd realized, and whether their mountain sanctuary was as safe as it appeared. Neither of them noticed the figure that melted back into the tree line after studying the cabin's layout for nearly an hour, or the way that same figure mounted a horse with practiced stealth and disappeared down the mountain trail toward town. Marcus. Whitmore had decided that if legal challenges wouldn't break up his cousin's marriage, perhaps more direct methods would prove effective. And he'd just learned exactly where the happy couple was spending their wedding night. Eleanor woke to the sound of Caleb moving quietly around the cabin, trying not to disturb her sleep. Grey dawn light filtered through the windows, and she could smell coffee brewing and something cooking over the fire. For a moment, the domestic scene felt so natural that she forgot their arrangement was temporary. "Morning," Caleb said when he noticed she was awake. "I've got breakfast started. There's fresh water in the basin if you'd like to wash up." Eleanor sat up carefully, aware that her hair had come loose from its pins during the night, and probably looked like she'd been sleeping in the wilderness, which, she supposed, she had. "Thank you. I'm sorry if I overslept." "You didn't," Caleb assured her. "Sun's barely up. I'm just used to early mornings." As Eleanor made herself presentable behind the curtained alcove, she found herself listening to the sounds of Caleb preparing their meal. There was something deeply comforting about the quiet efficiency of his movements, the way he seemed completely at home in this simple space. It occurred to her that she'd never shared morning routine with a man before. Her father had always taken breakfast alone in his study, and her brief encounters with suitors had never progressed beyond formal parlor visits. When she emerged, Caleb had set out a breakfast of eggs from his own chickens, bacon he'd cured himself, and bread baked fresh the previous day. The food was simple but perfectly prepared, seasoned with herbs from his garden. "This is delicious," Eleanor said, surprised by how hungry the mountain air had made her. "You're quite self-sufficient up here." "Have to be," Caleb replied. "Nearest neighbor is 10 miles away, and the general store in Cedar Ridge doesn't deliver to mountain cabins." They ate in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the day ahead. According to their agreement, Caleb would sign annulment papers this morning, and Eleanor would return to town to begin her new life as an independent woman with her inheritance secured. It should have been a moment of triumph, but instead Eleanor felt oddly reluctant to see their arrangement end. "The papers," she said finally, withdrawing the documents from her saddlebag. "Mr. Carruthers prepared them yesterday. All they need is your signature and a witness." Caleb accepted the papers, but didn't immediately reach for his pen. Instead, he read through them carefully, his expression unreadable. Eleanor found herself studying his face, noting the way morning light revealed flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the small lines around them that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and snow. "This is what you want?" he asked finally. "It's what we agreed upon," Eleanor replied. But even to her own ears, her voice lacked conviction. Before Caleb could respond, the sound of horses approaching the cabin brought both of them to their feet. Caleb moved immediately to the window, his entire demeanor changing from relaxed to alert in the space of a heartbeat. "Expecting company?" Eleanor asked. "No," Caleb said grimly. "And I don't like the way they're riding. Too fast, too purposeful." Eleanor joined him at the window and saw 3 men dismounting near the cabin's front door. She recognized none of them, but their expensive clothes and city-soft appearance marked them as outsiders to mountain country. The leader, a tall man with a carefully waxed mustache, carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin. "Mr. Stone, Mrs. Stone, open up. We have official business to discuss." Caleb glanced at Eleanor, noting the fear that flickered across her face. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, then moved to open the door. The 3 men stood on his small porch like a delegation from another world. Their leader stepped forward with a document in his hand and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Caleb Stone, I'm Detective William Hayes from the Territorial Marshal's Office. This is Deputy Morrison and Deputy Clark. We're here to investigate reports of marriage fraud." Eleanor felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Behind the 3 officials, she caught sight of a familiar figure, Marcus, sitting his horse at the edge of the clearing with the satisfied expression of a man whose plan was proceeding perfectly. "Marriage fraud?" Caleb's voice remained steady. But Eleanor could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "We've received information suggesting that your recent marriage to Miss Eleanor Whitmore was arranged solely for financial gain, with no intention of establishing a genuine marital relationship," Hayes continued. "That would constitute fraud under territorial law." "Who filed this complaint?" Eleanor demanded, stepping out from behind Caleb. Hayes consulted his paperwork. "A concerned family member who wishes to protect the interests of the Whitmore estate. The complainant alleges that you, Mr. Stone, agreed to this arrangement in exchange for monetary compensation, and that both parties intended to dissolve the marriage immediately after securing inheritance rights." Caleb's jaw tightened. "My marriage to Eleanor is legal and binding. We were wed by Reverend Morrison with proper witnesses." "Oh, the ceremony was legal," Hayes agreed. "But the intent behind it may not have been. If we can prove this was a business arrangement rather than a genuine union, the marriage can be annulled, and any inheritance transferred under its authority would be invalidated." Eleanor felt panic rising in her chest. Marcus had outmaneuvered her after all, using the law itself as a weapon against their carefully crafted plan. "You have no proof of any wrongdoing," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Don't we?" Hayes smiled that cold smile again. "We have testimony from hotel staff about separate rooms, reports of overheard conversations regarding business arrangements, and a very interesting investigation into Mr. Stone's background that raises questions about his suitability as a husband for a woman of your standing." "What kind of questions?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Hayes consulted another document. "Military records show you were discharged under circumstances that aren't entirely clear. There are gaps in your service record, suggestions of disciplinary issues. Some might wonder if Eleanor Whitmore really knew what kind of man she was marrying." Eleanor saw Caleb's hands clench into fists and instinctively stepped closer to him. Whatever shadows lay in his military past, she was certain they didn't involve anything dishonorable. The man she'd come to know over the past few days wasn't capable of the kind of deception Hayes was implying. "My husband's past is not your concern," Eleanor said firmly. "Our marriage is legal and valid, and I resent any implication otherwise." "Husband," Hayes raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting, considering witnesses at your reception reported hearing you refer to this as a temporary arrangement." Something about annulment papers already prepared? The blood drained from Eleanor's face. Someone had been listening carefully to their conversations, reporting back to Marcus with enough detail to build a case against them. She realized now how naive she'd been to think they could arrange a marriage of convenience without consequences. "I think you gentlemen should leave," Caleb said, stepping protectively in front of Eleanor. "Unless you have a warrant for our arrest, you're trespassing on my property." "Actually, we do have a warrant," Hayes replied, producing another document with obvious satisfaction. "For both of you, on charges of conspiracy to commit inheritance fraud. You'll need to come with us to town for questioning." Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. Everything she'd worked to preserve was crumbling. And worse, she dragged Caleb into a situation that could destroy him as well. The mountain sanctuary that had felt so peaceful just hours ago now seemed like a trap, surrounded by men whose authority could sweep away all her careful plans. "I need to see that warrant," Caleb said, holding out his hand. As Hayes passed over the legal document, Eleanor noticed an envelope tucked into his coat pocket, an envelope that bore the distinctive letterhead of a private investigation firm. Marcus hadn't just filed a complaint. He'd hired professionals to build a case against them. The threatening letter from Marcus that had arrived with the dawn mail now made perfect sense. It hadn't been a bluff or an empty threat. It had been a declaration of war. And Eleanor was beginning to realize she'd vastly underestimated her opponent's resources and determination. "We'll need to search the premises as well," Hayes announced, gesturing to his deputies, "looking for evidence of this business arrangement. Contracts, payment records, anything that might support the fraud allegations." "You have no right," Eleanor began. "We have every right," Hayes interrupted. "The warrant is quite comprehensive." As the deputies began searching through Caleb's simple possessions, Eleanor felt helpless rage building in her chest. These men were violating the sanctuary of a good man who'd only tried to help her, trampling through his private space in pursuit of evidence that would destroy them both. But as she watched Caleb's face during the search, Eleanor saw something that surprised her. Instead of the resigned defeat she might have expected, his expression was hardening into the kind of determined focus she imagined he'd worn during his military service. This was a man who'd faced worse enemies than corrupt officials and spoiled rich boys, and he wasn't planning to surrender without a fight. When Deputy Morrison emerged from behind Caleb's curtained alcove holding Eleanor's jewelry box, her heart sank. Inside that box were her mother's letters that mentioned her fears about never finding love, her concerns about fortune hunters, and her hopes that Eleanor would someday marry for genuine affection rather than convenience. "What's this?" Hayes asked, taking the box from his deputy. "Personal belongings," Eleanor said quickly. "Family mementos." Hayes opened the box, and Eleanor's mother's music box began to play its sweet, sad melody. For a moment, the sound seemed to fill the cabin with memories of childhood dreams and a mother's love, making the current situation feel even more surreal and devastating. "Love letters?" Hayes asked, spotting the bundle of correspondence. "From my mother," Eleanor said quietly. "She died 12 years ago." Something in her tone must have reached even Hayes's cynical heart, because he closed the box without reading the letters and handed it back to Deputy Morrison. But the damage was already done. They'd found evidence of Eleanor's true feelings about marriage and love, feelings that could be twisted to support the fraud charges. "I think we have enough," Hayes announced. "Mr. and Mrs. Stone, you'll need to come with us now. You can arrange for legal representation once we reach town." As Eleanor gathered her few belongings, her hands shaking with a mixture of fear and fury, she caught Caleb's eye. What she saw there surprised her, not defeat or accusation, but a kind of protective determination that made her heart skip a beat. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I want you to know that marrying you wasn't the mistake. Trusting that your cousin would accept defeat was the mistake." Eleanor felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall in front of Marcus's hired thugs. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I dragged you into this." "You didn't drag me anywhere," Caleb replied firmly. I made my choice with full knowledge of the risks. As they were escorted from the cabin toward the waiting horses, Eleanor realized that somewhere between their wedding ceremony and this moment of crisis, their business arrangement had become something deeper and more complex. The annulment papers lay unsigned on Caleb's table, but even if they'd completed that final step, it wouldn't have mattered. Marcus had played a longer game than either of them had anticipated, and now they would have to find a way to prove that their marriage was genuine, even though it had started as anything but. The ride back to Cedar Ridge felt like a funeral procession. Eleanor and Caleb rode side by side, their hands bound, an unnecessary humiliation that Hayes seemed to enjoy. Behind them, Marcus followed at a discreet distance, no doubt savoring his apparent victory. The morning that had begun with such promise now stretched ahead, filled with uncertainty and potential disaster. At the territorial courthouse, a small crowd had already gathered. Word of the arrests had spread through town like wildfire, and Eleanor could see curious faces pressed against shop windows, neighbors whispering among themselves about the dramatic turn in the Whitmore inheritance saga. She held her head high despite the circumstances, refusing to give the gossips the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Inside the courthouse, Hayes separated them for questioning. Eleanor was led to a small room, furnished with a scarred wooden table and 2 chairs, where she waited alone for nearly an hour before Hayes finally appeared with his stack of accusatory documents. "Mrs. Stone," he began, settling himself across from her with obvious satisfaction. "Or should I say Miss Whitmore, since your marriage appears to be invalid?" "My name is Eleanor Stone," she replied firmly, "and my marriage is perfectly valid." Hayes opened a folder and spread several papers across the table. "Let's examine the evidence, shall we? First, we have testimony from hotel staff that you and Mr. Stone maintained separate rooms until your wedding day. Hardly the behavior of a courting couple. We're private people," Eleanor said. "Some couples prefer propriety to public displays. Then, there's the matter of your marriage contract." Hayes produced a document that made Eleanor's blood run cold. It was a copy of the agreement she'd drafted, outlining their one-day arrangement. Quite businesslike for a romantic union, wouldn't you say? Eleanor's mind raced. The original contract was still in her saddlebag at Caleb's cabin, so where had this copy come from? Then she remembered the papers scattered across the cabin floor during the search, and realized that one of the deputies must have photographed or copied key documents. "That was a preliminary agreement," she said carefully. We wanted to be clear about our expectations before proceeding with marriage." Hayes smiled his predatory smile. "Expectations like one day only, and annulment papers to be signed immediately afterward. Most unusual vows, Mrs. Stone." Eleanor felt trapped. Every true statement she made sounded like a lie, and every lie felt transparent and desperate. Hayes was building his case methodically, and she was beginning to see how Marcus had outmaneuvered her so completely. "Tell me about Mr. Stone's payment," Hayes continued. $5,000, according to our information. Quite generous compensation for a day's work." "There was no payment," Eleanor lied, knowing it was hopeless. Hayes consulted another document. "Really? Because we have bank records showing you withdrew exactly that amount 2 days before your wedding. Cash withdrawal, which suggests you wanted to avoid creating a paper trail." Eleanor's heart sank. Marcus had been more thorough than she'd imagined, tracking her financial transactions and building an airtight case for fraud. She was beginning to realize that her cousin had been planning this counterattack from the moment she'd announced her engagement. Meanwhile, in another room, Caleb faced his own interrogation. Deputy Morrison, a younger man who seemed uncomfortable with the whole proceeding, was attempting to question him about his military service. "Sergeant Stone," Morrison began, consulting a file. "You served 8 years with the 7th Infantry, correct?" "That's right," Caleb replied. "Your discharge papers are interesting. They cite completion of service obligation, but there are some irregularities in your final months. Reports of insubordination, failure to follow direct orders." Caleb's jaw tightened. His final months in the army had indeed been difficult, but not for the reasons Morrison was implying. After Sarah's death, he'd been in no condition to continue military service, but his commanding officers had been reluctant to discharge a decorated veteran without cause. "I fulfilled my service commitment honorably," Caleb said firmly. "Perhaps," Morrison continued, "but there's also the matter of your sudden disappearance after discharge. You essentially vanished for 5 years until you mysteriously reappeared to marry the wealthiest woman in the territory. Some might find that suspicious." Caleb remained silent, knowing that explaining his grief-driven retreat to the mountains would only provide more ammunition for Hayes's case. How could he make these men understand that some wounds required solitude to heal? That sometimes the strongest thing a man could do was withdraw from the world until he was fit to rejoin it? "Mr. Stone," Morrison pressed, "did Eleanor Whitmore offer you money to marry her?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Caleb could lie and hope they couldn't prove otherwise, or he could tell the truth and watch their carefully constructed defense crumble completely. Before he could answer, commotion erupted in the courthouse hallway. Raised voices, rapid footsteps, and what sounded like someone demanding immediate access to the prisoners. Morrison stood up, clearly flustered by the interruption. The door burst open to reveal Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor's faithful housekeeper, followed by Reverend Morrison and Harold Carruthers. But most surprising was the fourth member of their impromptu rescue party, a tall, distinguished man in a military uniform bearing the insignia of a colonel. "What is the meaning of this?" the colonel demanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. "I demand to see Sergeant Stone immediately." Morrison, the deputy, not the reverend, stammered something about ongoing investigations and proper procedures. But the colonel brushed his objections aside like cobwebs. "Colonel William Harrison, retired," the military officer announced, "former commanding officer of Sergeant Stone. And I'll be damned if I'll let good men be railroaded by corrupt officials and greedy relatives." Mrs. Henderson pushed past the sputtering deputy to reach Caleb. "Mr. Stone, are you all right?" "When we heard about these ridiculous charges, Colonel Harrison came immediately. He has things to say about your character that these people need to hear." Colonel Harrison fixed Deputy Morrison with a stare that had once intimidated junior officers across 2 territories. "Son, I don't know what lies you've been told about Sergeant Stone's service record, but I'm here to set the record straight. This man is one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to command." "Sir, we have documentation," Morrison began. "Documentation can be falsified," Harrison interrupted. "Character cannot." Caleb Stone served with distinction in 3 major campaigns, saved the lives of dozens of his fellow soldiers, and earned decorations for valor that would make most men proud to serve under him. The colonel reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I brought his complete service record, including classified commendations that weren't included in his standard discharge papers. I also brought sworn statements from 12 of his former comrades attesting to his honor and integrity." As Harrison spread the documents across the table, Caleb felt a surge of gratitude toward his former commander. The colonel had traveled hundreds of miles to defend a soldier he hadn't seen in years, demonstrating the kind of loyalty that military service at its best could inspire. "The irregularities in his final months," Harrison continued, "were the result of my direct orders. Sergeant Stone had suffered a devastating personal loss, and I felt it was in everyone's best interest to allow him to complete his service obligation with modified duties while he grieved. Any suggestion of misconduct is not only false, but insulting to every man who served under his leadership." In the other room, similar reinforcements had arrived for Eleanor. Reverend Morrison was explaining to Hayes that he'd personally counseled Eleanor and Caleb before their wedding ceremony, and that while their courtship had been brief, he'd seen genuine affection between them. "Perhaps their romance was unconventional," the Reverend said, "but I've performed enough weddings to recognize the difference between a business arrangement and a genuine union." These two people care for each other, regardless of how their relationship began. Mrs. Henderson added her own testimony about Eleanor's behavior in the days leading up to the wedding. "I've known that girl since she was born," she declared. "I watched her fall in love with Mr. Stone despite herself. She tried to convince herself it was merely business, but love doesn't follow the rules we set for it." But the most devastating blow to Hayes's case came from an unexpected source. Harold Carruthers, the nervous banker who'd helped Marcus build his legal challenge, suddenly appeared in the hallway with a leather satchel and a guilty expression. "I need to speak with Detective Hayes immediately," Carruthers announced. "I have information that changes everything about this case." When Hayes emerged from his interrogation of Eleanor, Carruthers was waiting with documents that made the detective's confident expression falter for the first time. "What is this?" Hayes demanded, reviewing the papers. "Evidence that Marcus Whitmore has been bribing witnesses and falsifying documents," Carruthers said quietly. "I've been keeping careful records of every transaction, every payoff, every lie he's asked me to support. I couldn't live with being part of this fraud any longer. The papers revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond simple inheritance dispute. Marcus had paid hotel staff to lie about Eleanor and Caleb's behavior, had hired forgers to create false documents, and had even attempted to bribe military records clerks to alter Caleb's service history. "Why are you coming forward now?" Hayes asked suspiciously. Carruthers straightened his shoulders with what might have been the first moment of courage in his banking career. "Because I've watched Eleanor Whitmore grow up, and she's worth 10 of Marcus Whitmore. What we're doing here isn't justice, it's persecution of two good people by a man who can't accept that he's not entitled to wealth he never earned." From his hidden savings pouch, Caleb had intended to offer Eleanor a new life, far from the complications of her inheritance. The small leather bag contained gold coins and bills he'd saved over years of careful living, enough to start fresh somewhere. Marcus's influence couldn't reach them. But now, as the truth emerged about his cousin's machinations, that escape plan seemed less necessary. As Hayes reviewed Carruthers' evidence, his case against Eleanor and Caleb crumbled like a house built on sand. The conspiracy charges would have to be dropped, but more than that, Marcus himself now faced potential prosecution for fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. "Release them," Hayes ordered his deputies, his earlier confidence replaced by the sour expression of a man who'd bet on the wrong horse. When Eleanor and Caleb were reunited in the courthouse hallway, they found themselves surrounded by unexpected allies. Colonel Harrison was regaling Mrs. Henderson with stories of Caleb's heroism, while Reverend Morrison discussed the theological implications of love that grows from practical beginnings. "How did you know to come?" Eleanor asked Mrs. Henderson. "Marcus made a mistake," the housekeeper replied with satisfaction. "He bragged to the hotel staff about his clever plan, not realizing that some of those people have worked for your family for years. They came to me this morning with the whole story." Eleanor looked at Caleb, seeing him with new eyes. The mountain hermit she'd thought she was hiring had turned out to be a decorated war hero, a man whose retreat from society had been motivated by grief rather than cowardice. And he'd agreed to help her despite knowing it might expose him to exactly the kind of scrutiny he'd spent years avoiding. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I had no idea Marcus would go this far." "Neither did I," Caleb admitted. "But I'm glad we found out what kind of man he really is before he could do more damage." As they prepared to leave the courthouse, free but forever changed by the morning's events, Eleanor realized that their marriage of convenience had become something else entirely. They'd faced adversity together, had been defended by people who believed in their union, and had discovered depths in each other that neither had expected. The annulment papers remained unsigned at Caleb's cabin, but Eleanor was beginning to wonder if they would ever be signed at all. What had started as a business arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had planned for, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared adversity, and the growing realization that they might actually be falling in love. Outside the courthouse, Marcus waited with the expression of a man whose world had just collapsed around him. The inheritance he'd considered already his was now permanently beyond his reach. And worse, he faced potential criminal charges for his attempts to steal it through fraud and bribery. "This isn't over," he said, as Eleanor and Caleb emerged from the building. "I'll appeal. I'll find other ways." "No, Marcus," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying a new strength that surprised even her. "It is over. You've shown your true character today, and everyone in this town has seen it. You have no power here anymore." Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his military bearing making Marcus instinctively step back. "Young man, I suggest you count yourself fortunate that we're choosing not to press additional charges. Attempting to suborn military records is a federal offense." As Marcus slunk away, defeated and discredited, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For the first time since her father's death, she was truly free to choose her own path, and that path was beginning to look very different from the one she'd originally planned. Walking back toward the hotel with Caleb beside her, Eleanor realized that their day of reckoning had become something else entirely. Instead of ending their arrangement, the crisis had forged it into something stronger and more real than either had dared to hope for. That evening, as Eleanor and Caleb sat in the hotel dining room, surrounded by well-wishers celebrating their vindication, neither could shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Marcus had slipped away from the courthouse like a wounded animal, and wounded animals were often at their most dangerous. Colonel Harrison joined them for dinner, regaling the small crowd with stories of Caleb's military service that painted a picture of a man Eleanor was still learning to know. She listened with growing amazement as the colonel described acts of heroism and leadership that her mountain hermit had never mentioned. "The Battle of Crow Creek," Harrison was saying, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Caleb's unit was pinned down by hostile fire, ammunition running low, no hope of reinforcement. Most commanders would have ordered a retreat. Caleb rallied his men and led a charge that broke the enemy line and saved 2 companies of cavalry." Eleanor glanced at Caleb, who was staring into his coffee cup with obvious discomfort at being the center of attention. "You never mentioned any of this," she said quietly. "It was a long time ago," Caleb replied. "Different man, different life, was it?" Eleanor asked. "Because the man who agreed to help me despite personal risk sounds very much like the soldier Colonel Harrison is describing." Later that evening, as they prepared to return to the mountain cabin, Mrs. Henderson pulled Eleanor aside with a worried expression. "Miss Eleanor, I've been hearing troubling rumors around town. Some folks say Marcus left on the evening train, but others claim they saw him heading toward his hotel room with men who didn't look like local people." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "What kind of men?" "Rough sorts. The kind you might hire if you wanted something done but didn't want to dirty your own hands doing it." The implication hung heavy between them. Marcus had already demonstrated his willingness to use underhanded methods to achieve his goals. With legal avenues closed to him, he might be desperate enough to attempt something more direct and dangerous. "You should stay in town tonight," Mrs. Henderson urged. "The hotel is safe, with plenty of witnesses around. Don't go back to that isolated cabin until we're sure Marcus has truly given up." But Caleb, overhearing the conversation, shook his head firmly. "Running won't solve anything. If Marcus is planning something, I'd rather face it on ground I know than be trapped in town where innocent people might get hurt." Eleanor saw the logic in his reasoning, but she also saw something else in his expression, the look of a soldier preparing for battle. Whatever shadows Marcus might send after them, Caleb was ready to meet them. The question was whether Eleanor was prepared for what that confrontation might cost. They left Cedar Ridge as the sun was setting, taking the familiar mountain trail toward Caleb's sanctuary. But this time, Caleb's demeanor was different. His eyes constantly scanned the surrounding terrain, and he'd armed himself with a rifle that had been conspicuously absent during their previous journey. "You're expecting trouble," Eleanor observed. "I'm prepared for it," Caleb corrected. There's a difference. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Eleanor found herself studying her husband. For that's what he was, she realized, regardless of how their marriage had begun. The legal challenges had been dropped, the inheritance was secure, but the annulment papers remained unsigned. Somewhere between their wedding ceremony and this moment, their arrangement had become something real. "Caleb," she said, as they paused to rest the horses. "What happens now? I mean, after we deal with whatever Marcus is planning. What happens to us?" Caleb was quiet for so long that Eleanor wondered if he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of uncertainty she'd never heard before. "I don't know," he admitted. 3 days ago, I thought I had my life figured out. Simple, solitary, safe. Now I'm married to a woman who's made me remember things I thought I'd buried forever." "What kind of things?" "What it feels like to want to protect someone, to worry about someone else's welfare more than your own, to wake up in the morning and be glad you're not alone." Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat at his words. "And how do you feel about remembering those things?" Caleb turned to look at her directly, and in the fading light she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. "Terrified," he said simply, "and more alive than I've felt in 5 years." When they reached the cabin, Caleb's military training took over completely. He secured the horses in the stable, then carefully examined the cabin's exterior for signs of intrusion. Eleanor watched him work, noting the professional thoroughness of his inspection. The way he checked angles of approach and defensive positions. Inside the cabin, he moved with quiet efficiency to prepare for whatever the night might bring. From a hidden compartment behind the fireplace, he retrieved additional weapons. A shotgun, a pistol, and a knife that looked like it had seen considerable use. "How long have you been expecting this?" Eleanor asked, watching him check the shotgun's action. "Since the moment Marcus threatened you at the hotel," Caleb replied. "Men like him don't accept defeat gracefully. They escalate until someone forces them to stop." Eleanor retrieved her father's shotgun from her saddlebag, a weapon she'd brought instinctively but hoped never to use. Thomas Whitmore had insisted his daughter learn to handle firearms, saying the frontier was no place for helpless women. Now she was grateful for those long-ago lessons. "Do you know how to use that?" Caleb asked, noting her practiced handling of the weapon. "My father made sure of it," Eleanor replied. "I'm not helpless, Caleb. Whatever's coming, we'll face it together." As full darkness settled over the mountains, they settled into a defensive routine that spoke of Caleb's military experience. He extinguished all lights except one small lamp shielded so it couldn't be seen from outside, then positioned himself at the front window where he could watch the approaches to the cabin. Eleanor took up position at the rear window, her father's shotgun ready, her nerves stretched tight with anticipation. The mountain silence that had once felt peaceful now seemed ominous, full of potential threats moving unseen through the darkness. "Tell me about your wife," Eleanor said quietly, needing conversation to break the tension. "Sarah," Caleb's hand stilled on his rifle. "What made you ask about her?" "The cross on your mantle. The way you carved it with such care. She must have meant everything to you." For a long moment, Caleb was silent. Then, perhaps because the darkness made confession easier, he began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "We met at a church social in Kansas. She was the minister's daughter, and I was a soldier on leave. Everyone said we were too different. She was all light and faith, and I was already carrying too many shadows from the war. But she saw something in me worth saving." Eleanor listened without interruption, sensing that this was a story Caleb had never told anyone. "We had 2 years together before the railroad accident. She was carrying our child. Our son would have been born that spring. They died together, and I died with them in every way that mattered." "Is that why you came to the mountains?" "I came here to disappear," Caleb said, "to let the man I'd been fade away like smoke. I thought if I stayed alone long enough, the pain would fade too. Did it?" "The sharp edges wore smooth," Caleb admitted. "But it never really went away. Not until—" He stopped abruptly, but Eleanor understood what he couldn't quite say. Not until she'd walked into his life with her desperate proposal and reminded him that some risks were worth taking. that some forms of pain were preferable to the safety of complete isolation. Around midnight, their vigil was broken by the soft sound of horses moving carefully through the trees around the cabin. Caleb held up a hand for silence, then moved to a different window to get a better view of the approaching threat. "How many?" Eleanor whispered. "4, maybe 5, Caleb replied. "They're trying to surround the cabin." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, but alongside the fear came a strange sense of clarity. This was the moment she'd been unconsciously preparing for, since the day she'd decided to take control of her own destiny. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just her survival, but the future of the fragile new life she and Caleb were building together. "What's the plan?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Caleb gave her a look of approval that warmed her despite their dangerous circumstances. "We make them regret underestimating mountain folk," he said grimly. "And we make sure Marcus learns that some women are worth fighting for." Outside, figures moved through the darkness with the careful stealth of men who believed they had the advantage. But they were about to discover that Caleb Stone hadn't survived 8 years of military service and 5 years of mountain living by being unprepared for trouble. The battle for their future was about to begin, and Eleanor Stone, no longer the sheltered heiress who'd ridden into these mountains 3 days ago, was ready to fight for the love she'd never expected to find. The first shot shattered the mountain silence at exactly 12:47 in the morning, splintering the cabin's front door and sending both Eleanor and Caleb diving for cover. The careful stealth of their attackers had given way to direct assault, and the night erupted into chaos. "Stone!" a voice called from the darkness. "Send out the woman and we'll make this quick." Caleb's response was a rifle shot that sparked off the rocks near the voice's origin. Years of mountain hunting had made him intimately familiar with sound and distance in these peaks, and his shot was close enough to send the speaker scrambling for better cover. "How many did you count?" Eleanor asked, checking her shotgun's load. 5 for certain," Caleb replied, moving to a new position as return fire punched holes in the cabin's log walls. "Probably hired guns from Denver or Colorado Springs. Professional, but not used to mountain fighting." Another volley crashed into the cabin, and Eleanor felt splinters shower down from the roof beams. These men weren't trying to capture them alive. They were shooting to kill, which meant Marcus had given up any pretense of legal maneuvering in favor of permanent solutions. Caleb's hunting knife, worn smooth by years of use and perfectly balanced for throwing, hung at his belt, ready for close work if the gunman breached the cabin's defenses. He'd used it to dress deer and elk countless times, but tonight it might serve a grimmer purpose. The attackers had positioned themselves in a rough semicircle around the cabin's front, taking advantage of rock outcroppings and fallen trees for cover. Their leader, a lean man with the cold eyes of a professional killer, directed the assault with military precision, clearly intending to overwhelm the cabin's defenders through superior firepower. "They're going to rush us," Caleb said, recognizing the pattern of suppressing fire that preceded an infantry charge. "When they do, aim for center mass and don't hesitate. These men won't show us any mercy." Eleanor nodded, her father's training taking over as adrenaline sharpened her focus. She'd never shot at another human being, but she understood with crystal clarity that her life and Caleb's depended on her willingness to do exactly that. The charge came from 3 directions. Simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to divide the defenders' attention. 2 men approached the front door, while another circled toward the rear window where Eleanor waited. The remaining attackers provided covering fire, their muzzle flashes creating a deadly light show in the mountain darkness. Eleanor's first shot took the man approaching her window square in the chest, the shotgun's heavy load dropping him before he could raise his own weapon. The recoil jarred her shoulder, but her training held firm as she quickly reloaded and shifted position. At the front of the cabin, Caleb's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession. One attacker stumbled and fell, while the second dove behind the cabin's woodpile, wounded but still dangerous. The professional discipline of his military service had taken over completely, and he moved with the fluid efficiency of a man who'd survived worse odds through skill and determination. "Eleanor," Caleb called. "Are you hit?" "I'm fine," she replied, though her hands were shaking from the adrenaline surge. "One down back here." The surviving gunmen regrouped quickly, their leader's voice cutting through the confusion with orders that spoke of experience in similar situations. These weren't common thugs, Eleanor realized. They were veterans of range wars and territorial disputes. Men who killed for money and asked no questions about their employers. A new sound reached them through the gunfire, the crackle of flames. One of the attackers had circled around to the cabin's blind side and set fire to the woodshed. The dry timber caught quickly, and within minutes, flames were licking at the cabin's rear wall. "They're trying to burn us out," Eleanor said. Smelling smoke even through the log walls, Caleb made a rapid calculation. The cabin would become untenable within minutes, but stepping outside meant exposing themselves to concentrated fire from the remaining gunmen. Yet staying meant burning alive or suffocating from smoke, choices that all led to the same deadly conclusion. "We're going to have to run for the stable," he decided. "The horses are our only chance of getting out of this alive." Eleanor understood the plan immediately. The stable was built into the hillside behind the cabin, offering both cover and the possibility of escape if they could reach their mounts. But the 30 yards between the cabin and stable might as well have been 30 miles under the current circumstances. "On 3, Caleb said, moving toward the cabin's rear door. "Stay low, move fast, and don't look back." Eleanor positioned herself beside him, her father's shotgun ready, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the walls, she could hear their attackers closing in, confident that fire would succeed where bullets had failed. 1, Caleb counted, his hand on the door latch. Outside, flames climbed higher and casting dancing shadows that would make accurate shooting difficult for both sides. 2. Eleanor took a deep breath, thinking of her mother's faith in true love, her father's belief in her strength, and the unexpected gift of finding both in the man beside her. 3. The door burst open, and they exploded into the firelit chaos of the night. Immediately, muzzle flashes erupted from their left as the surviving gunman opened fire. Eleanor felt the wind of a bullet pass her cheek as she ran, her boots slipping on loose stones as she followed Caleb's zigzagging path toward the stable. Halfway to safety, Caleb stumbled and went down hard. Eleanor's heart stopped as she saw blood spreading across his shirt, but even wounded, his soldier's instincts remained sharp. He rolled behind a boulder and continued firing, his shots forcing their attackers to seek cover. "Go!" he shouted to Eleanor. "Get to the horses." Instead of following his order, Eleanor doubled back to where Caleb had fallen. She couldn't abandon him, wouldn't leave the man who'd become her anchor in a world gone mad. Her shotgun boomed twice more, driving back a gunman who'd been closing in for a killing shot. "You stubborn woman," Caleb gasped as she helped him to his feet. "I told you to run and leave my husband," Eleanor replied, supporting his weight as they stumbled toward the stable. Not likely. They reached the relative safety of the stable just as the cabin's roof began to collapse, sending showers of sparks into the night sky. Inside the small structure, Eleanor quickly assessed Caleb's wound, a bullet graze along his ribs that was painful but not fatal. "Can you ride?" she asked, already saddling Lady with practiced efficiency. "I'll have to," Caleb replied, struggling into Ranger's saddle despite the pain. "They'll regroup and try to flush us out of here soon enough." Outside, they could hear the remaining gunmen arguing about their next move. The fire had eliminated the cabin as shelter, but it had also destroyed whatever evidence might have linked the attack to Marcus. Professional killers were careful about such details, and these men were clearly experienced in covering their tracks. Eleanor mounted Lady and moved to the stable doors, peering through a crack at the scene outside. 3 figures moved through the firelight, searching for any sign that their targets had survived the blaze. If she and Caleb could slip away quietly, they might escape, while their attackers assumed they died in the burning cabin. But as she watched, The lean leader of the gunmen stopped near the stable and cocked his head, listening. Years of hunting men had taught him to recognize the small sounds that betrayed hidden prey, and something about the stable's silence struck him as suspicious. "Check the stable," he ordered his remaining men. "Make sure they didn't make it that far." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Discovery was moments away, and with Caleb wounded, a running fight through the mountains would likely prove fatal. They needed a different strategy, something that would even the odds or eliminate them entirely. That's when she noticed the oil lamp, hanging just inside the stable door, the same type of lamp that had been used to start the fire that destroyed the cabin. Sometimes, Eleanor realized, the best defense was an overwhelming offense that caught your enemies completely off guard. "Caleb," she whispered urgently, "when I give the word, ride hard for the trail. Don't look back, don't slow down, just get to safety." "What are you planning?" he asked, recognizing the dangerous glint in her eyes. Eleanor's answer was to smash the oil lamp against the stable's wooden wall, sending flaming oil spreading across the dry timber. Within seconds, the entire structure was ablaze, and she was riding Lady hard through the stable doors into the chaos of the night, the sudden eruption of fire and the appearance of a rider emerging from what should have been certain death caught the gunman completely off guard. Eleanor's shotgun roared twice more as she charged through their scattered formation, her war cry echoing off the mountain peaks like something from ancient legend. In the confusion, Caleb followed her lead, his rifle adding to the chaos as he put Ranger into a gallop that carried him past the stunned attackers. Pain from his wound nearly unseated him twice, but determination and years of horsemanship kept him in the saddle. Behind them, the blazing stable collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame, but Eleanor and Caleb were already disappearing into the mountain darkness, leaving their would-be killers to explain to Marcus why his final solution had failed as completely as all his previous schemes. They rode hard through the mountain darkness, following trails that only Caleb knew, his intimate knowledge of the terrain their only advantage against pursuers who would surely follow. Behind them, the glow of burning buildings painted the sky orange, but ahead lay only the uncertain safety of wilderness that could hide them or kill them with equal indifference. Caleb's wound was worse than he'd initially thought. Blood had soaked through his shirt and was beginning to affect his balance in the saddle. Eleanor noticed his increasing difficulty staying mounted and called for a halt in a small clearing where a stream provided fresh water and concealment from the main trail. "You need medical attention," she said, helping him dismount. "That wound is bleeding too heavily." "Can't stop for long," Caleb replied through gritted teeth. "They'll track us by the blood trail if nothing else." Eleanor tore strips from her petticoat to fashion bandages, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. As she cleaned and dressed Caleb's wound by moonlight, she marveled at how much her life had changed in just 4 days. The sheltered heiress who'd proposed marriage to a stranger was gone, replaced by a woman who could shoot to kill and tend battle wounds without flinching. "Where can we go?" she asked as she secured the makeshift bandage. "They'll be watching the roads back to town." Caleb pointed toward the higher peaks, barely visible in the starlight. "There's an old mining camp about 10 miles north, abandoned for years, but the buildings are still sound. We can hole up there while I heal and figure out our next move." The sound of distant horses reached them. Through the mountain air, their pursuers had regrouped faster than expected and were following their trail with professional determination. Eleanor helped Caleb back into his saddle, noting the pallor of his face and the way he swayed with exhaustion. "Can you make 10 miles?" she asked. "I'll make it." Caleb replied with the grim determination of a soldier who'd learned that survival often came down to refusing to quit when quitting would be easier. They resumed their desperate flight, climbing higher into terrain that grew increasingly treacherous in the darkness. Lady picked her way carefully along narrow ledges where a single misstep would mean a fatal fall, while Ranger followed with the steady reliability that had made him Caleb's trusted companion through 5 years of mountain living. As they climbed, The air grew thinner and colder, carrying the promise of winter snows that were still weeks away, but already gathering in the high peaks. Eleanor pulled her traveling cloak tighter around her shoulders and wondered if they would live long enough to see the sunrise that was still hours away. The sound of the town bell began echoing through the valleys below them, a slow, measured tolling that spoke of emergency and summoned the community to action. Someone in Cedar Ridge had seen the flames and realized that the Whitmore estate's problems had escalated into open violence. "Help's coming," Eleanor said, though she knew it would arrive too late to affect their immediate situation. "Not soon enough," Caleb replied, listening to the sounds of pursuit growing closer. "We're going to have to make a stand somewhere." They found their battleground at a narrow pass where the trail wound between towering rock walls. It was a natural choke point where a few defenders could hold off a larger force. But it was also a potential trap if their enemies found another way around the rocks. Eleanor dismounted and led Lady into a sheltered alcove where the horses would be protected from stray bullets. Caleb positioned himself behind a fallen boulder that commanded the approach to the pass, his rifle ready despite the weakness from blood loss that made his hands shake slightly. "How many rounds do you have left?" Eleanor asked, checking her own ammunition. "Enough," Caleb said. Though they both knew their supplies were running dangerously low, the wait stretched endlessly, filled with the kind of tense silence that preceded violence. Eleanor found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment, from her father's death through Marcus's schemes to this life-or-death struggle in the Montana wilderness. Whatever happened in the next hour, she regretted none of it. When the attack came, it was swift and brutal. The surviving gunmen had learned caution from their earlier encounter, and they approached the pass with the methodical advance of professionals who decided to end this matter permanently. The leader appeared first, using the rocks for cover as he worked his way up the trail. Eleanor's shotgun boomed in the confined space, the sound echoing off stone walls like thunder. Her shot went wide, but it forced the gunman to dive for cover and gave away his position to Caleb's more accurate rifle. Two more attackers tried to flank their position by climbing the rocks on either side of the pass. Eleanor tracked one with her father's weapon while Caleb engaged the other, their defensive fire creating a deadly crossfire that made the approach costly for their enemies. But ammunition was running low, and Caleb's wound was sapping his strength with each passing minute. Eleanor could see him struggling to maintain focus, his shots becoming less precise as blood loss took its toll. "Caleb," she said urgently, "you need to conserve your strength. Let me—" Her words were cut off by the crack of a rifle from an unexpected direction. One of the gunmen had found a way around the rocks and was firing down at them from above. His first shot kicked up stone chips inches from Eleanor's head, and she realized their defensive position had become a death trap. "We have to move!" Caleb shouted. But even as he spoke, Eleanor could see he lacked the strength for another running fight. That's when the mountain itself seemed to come alive with the sound of approaching horses. Not the careful advance of hired killers, but the thunderous charge of men riding hard toward the sound of gunfire. The town bell had done its work. Help had arrived from Cedar Ridge. Colonel Harrison's voice rang out across the rocks like a cavalry bugle, calling orders that spoke of military precision and overwhelming force. "Surrender now, and you'll live to stand trial. Continue fighting and we'll leave your bones for the buzzards." Eleanor had never been so happy to hear another human voice. The retired colonel had organized a rescue party and ridden through the night, bringing enough firepower to end Marcus's hired violence once and for all. The gunman's leader, caught between the defensive fire from the pass and the approaching cavalry charge, made the calculation that professional killers always made when the odds turned against them. Survival was more important than completing the contract, and discretion was definitely the better part of valor. "Fall back," he called to his remaining men. "This job's finished." The sound of retreating horses gradually faded into the distance, leaving Eleanor and Caleb alone in their rocky fortress with the approaching sound of rescue. When Colonel Harrison appeared at the head of a dozen armed townsmen, Eleanor nearly wept with relief. "Sergeant Stone." "Eleanor!" the colonel called. "Are you injured?" "Caleb's been shot," Eleanor replied, helping her husband to his feet. "He needs a doctor." Dr. Matthews, Cedar Ridge's elderly physician, had ridden with the rescue party and quickly took charge of Caleb's medical care. As he cleaned and properly dressed the wound, he grumbled about people who thought they could practice frontier medicine with torn petticoats and wishful thinking. "You'll live," he pronounced after his examination. "But you need rest and proper care. No more midnight battles for at least a week." Mrs. Henderson appeared with supplies from town, food, blankets, and the kind of maternal concern that Eleanor had missed since her mother's death. "Miss Eleanor, when we saw those flames, we feared the worst. Thank Providence you're both safe." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold, Eleanor and Caleb found themselves surrounded by friends who'd risked their own safety to ensure their rescue. The community that Eleanor had always felt separate from had rallied to protect two of its own, and the gesture moved her more than she could express. "What about Marcus?" Eleanor asked Colonel Harrison. "Under arrest," the colonel replied with satisfaction. "Mr. Carruthers provided enough evidence to charge him with conspiracy and attempted murder. He'll be spending the next decade in territorial prison, assuming he's lucky enough to avoid a hanging." The immediate threat was over. But as Eleanor looked at Caleb, wounded but alive, exhausted but smiling, she realized their real story was just beginning. They'd survived Marcus's worst efforts, had fought side by side through the darkest night of their lives, and had discovered that their marriage of convenience had become something profound and unbreakable. The annulment papers were ash now, destroyed when the cabin burned, but Eleanor found she didn't mourn their loss. Some contracts were meant to be superseded by better arrangements, and love was definitely a better arrangement than convenience. 3 months later, as winter's first snow dusted the peaks around their new home, Eleanor Stone stood at the kitchen window of the house she and Caleb had built together in the valley below his burned cabin. The structure was larger than his mountain sanctuary had been, designed for two people who planned to share a life rather than one person seeking solitude. The recovery had been slow but steady. Caleb's wound had healed cleanly under Dr. Matthews' care, though he still carried a scar that would remind them both of the night they'd fought for their future. More challenging had been the emotional healing, learning to trust that their marriage had become real, that the feelings between them were genuine rather than convenient. Eleanor had surprised everyone, including herself, by choosing to use her inheritance to establish a school for frontier children. The Whitmore Academy opened its doors in November, housed in a beautiful building that served families throughout the territory. Teaching gave her a purpose beyond mere wealth, and watching children learn reminded her daily of the hope and possibility that love could bring to even the most unlikely circumstances. Caleb had returned to his work as a guide and hunter, but now he came home each evening to a wife who waited for him with genuine warmth rather than business arrangements. He'd also taken on the role of sheriff's deputy, his military skills and mountain knowledge making him invaluable in keeping peace across the scattered settlements of the territory. On their kitchen table sat a small wooden music box that played the same sweet melody Eleanor remembered from childhood. Caleb had carved it himself during his convalescence, fashioning it from mountain oak and decorating it with intricate patterns that spoke of patience and love. It was her Christmas gift, he'd said, though Christmas was still weeks away. Too early for snow, Caleb observed, entering the kitchen with an armload of firewood. His movements were still careful, protecting the healing wound, but his strength had returned along with the easy smile that had been absent during his years of isolation. "I like it," Eleanor replied, moving to help him stack the wood beside their stone fireplace. "It makes everything look clean and new." Their house reflected both their personalities, Eleanor's love of books and music, combined with Caleb's practical efficiency and mountain craftsmanship. The parlour held her piano, shipped from back east at considerable expense, alongside his handmade furniture. Their bedroom was decorated with quilts Mrs. Henderson had sewn as a wedding gift, displayed next to Caleb's rifle and Eleanor's father's shotgun. The wooden cross from Caleb's old cabin held a place of honor above their mantelpiece, but it no longer stood alone. Beside it hung their marriage certificate, the real one, signed with genuine love rather than business necessity, and a photograph taken on the day the school opened, showing Eleanor surrounded by her students, while Caleb watched from the background with obvious pride. A knock at their door interrupted Eleanor's thoughts, and she opened it to find Mrs. Henderson standing on their porch with a basket of fresh bread and the latest news from town. "How are the newlyweds?" the housekeeper asked with a warm smile. The whole town had taken to referring to Eleanor and Caleb as newlyweds, despite the fact that their marriage was now several months old. Perhaps it was because their love seemed so fresh and new, or perhaps because everyone enjoyed a romance that had triumphed over such dramatic obstacles. "Quite well," Eleanor replied, accepting the bread gratefully. "Caleb's wound is healing nicely, and we're settling into our new routine. And Marcus?" Mrs. Henderson inquired, though her tone suggested she was asking more from curiosity than concern. "Sentenced to 15 years, Eleanor said. The judge wasn't sympathetic to someone who'd hired killers to settle inheritance disputes. He'll be an old man before he sees freedom again." They settled around the kitchen table for coffee and conversation, the kind of comfortable domestic scene that Eleanor had dreamed of but never dared hope for. Through the window, she could see Caleb working in their small stable, tending to Lady and Ranger with the same careful attention he brought to everything he cared about. "I have news," Mrs. Henderson announced with the satisfied expression of someone bearing good tidings. "Colonel Harrison received word from the territorial capital. They're recommending Caleb for a commendation for his service during the troubles with Marcus. Seems his handling of the situation has impressed some important people." Eleanor felt a surge of pride for her husband. The man who'd spent 5 years hiding from recognition was finally receiving the acknowledgement he deserved. "He won't like the attention," she said. "Perhaps not," Mrs. Henderson agreed. "But sometimes good men need to be reminded of their worth, whether they want the reminder or not." When Caleb returned from the stable, brushing snow from his coat, he found the two women discussing plans for the school's Christmas pageant. Eleanor had thrown herself into her teaching role with the same determination she'd once applied to managing her father's business affairs, and the results had been remarkable. Children who'd never had formal education were learning to read and write, while their families discovered that education could open doors they'd never imagined. "The Morrison children want to perform a song about mountain life," Eleanor was saying. "And little Sarah Fletcher has written a poem about her family's journey west." Caleb settled into his chair beside the fire, content to listen to his wife's enthusiasm for her work. The transformation in Eleanor had been as remarkable as any he'd witnessed. The reserved heiress who'd ridden into his mountains with a desperate proposal had become a woman who laughed easily, who found joy in simple pleasures, who discovered that love was indeed worth waiting for. After Mrs. Henderson departed with promises to return for Sunday dinner, Eleanor and Caleb found themselves alone in the comfortable silence of a couple who'd learned to appreciate each other's company. The snow continued to fall outside their windows, but inside their home, warmth and contentment reigned. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked suddenly, curled beside Caleb on their small sofa. "Giving up your solitude for all this domesticity?" Caleb considered the question seriously, as he considered all of Eleanor's questions. "I regret the years I wasted hiding from life," he said finally. "But I don't regret a single moment since you walked into my cabin with that impossible proposal." Eleanor smiled, remembering the desperate woman who'd ridden into the mountains seeking a business arrangement. "My mother always said love would find me when I least expected it. I never imagined it would come disguised as a marriage of convenience." "Maybe that's how the best love comes," Caleb suggested. "When we're not looking for it, when we're focused on solving other problems." Maybe love works best when it surprises us. From the mantelpiece, Eleanor's music box played its sweet melody as the wind stirred its delicate mechanism. The sound carried memories of childhood dreams and mother's wisdom, but also the promise of new dreams yet to be fulfilled. As evening settled over their mountain valley, Eleanor and Caleb prepared for bed with the comfortable routine of a couple who'd chosen each other not once but many times. In a moment of desperate need, in a courthouse under attack, in a burning cabin under siege, and in 100 small moments since when they'd had the opportunity to choose differently but had chosen instead to build something lasting. Together, their new wedding rings, simple, bands of Montana gold that Caleb had crafted himself, caught the firelight as they moved through their evening preparations. The rings had replaced Eleanor's mother's band, which now rested in a place of honor in their bedroom, a bridge between the love that had shaped Eleanor's understanding of marriage and the love she'd found for herself. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in pristine white that would last until spring's arrival. But inside their home, Eleanor and Caleb Stone settled into the kind of contentment that came from having fought for their happiness and won. The inheritance that had started their story remained secure, but it had become the least important part of Eleanor's wealth. True riches, she'd discovered, lay in waking up beside someone who'd chosen to love her not for her money or her social position, but for the woman she was when all the external trappings were stripped away. And Caleb, who'd spent 5 years believing that his capacity for love had died with Sarah and their unborn child, had learned that the heart was more resilient than he'd imagined. Love hadn't replaced what he'd lost. Nothing could do that, but it had given him reason to build something new on the foundation of hard-won wisdom and second chances. As they lay in their marriage bed, listening to the wind in the pines and the soft sounds of their valley settling into winter sleep, Eleanor and Caleb held each other with the gratitude of people who'd discovered that sometimes the most desperate moments in our lives really do lead to the most unexpected blessings. Their story had begun with a question that seemed purely practical. Will you be my husband for one day? But the answer had evolved into something neither of them had dared hope for, a lifetime of shared mornings, shared struggles, shared joys, and the deep contentment that comes from finding the person who makes you want to be brave enough to love again. In the distance, barely audible through the winter wind, the church bell in Cedar Ridge chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in their new life together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose each other, new moments to build on the foundation they'd established through fire and adversity. But tonight, there was only the warmth of their shared bed, the comfort of knowing they'd found something worth fighting for, and the quiet miracle of love that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings into something as enduring as the mountains that sheltered their valley home. Sometimes, Eleanor thought as sleep finally claimed her, the best marriages really do begin with the most practical of proposals and the most impractical of dreams.